Her hands didn't shake when she stitched a man's chest back together in a collapsing barn. They didn't shake when they told her she was finished, that her career, her reputation, everything she'd built across 11 years of saving lives was over. They shook now. Standing on a platform in the middle of Wyoming with $4 in her pocket. No clinic, no doctor, no one, just dust, wind, and a train disappearing into the horizon like it was ashamed of what it had delivered. Clara Bennett pressed her hands flat against her medical bag until they stopped. Then she picked it up and walked toward a town that wasn't expecting her. Subscribe to our channel. Follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Let's see how far Clara's story travels. Wyoming Territory, summer of 1887. The platform at Silver Creek Station was 12 feet of warped wood and one broken bench. Clara Bennett stood in the middle of it and did not cry. She had promised herself that much at least, that whatever happened when she stepped off that train, she would not cry in public. Not again. She had done enough of that in Chicago, standing outside the hospital, where she had worked for 11 years, while a man in a pressed suit told her she was no longer needed. She had walked to the end of the block before the tears came. She had turned the corner before she let herself fall apart. She was not going to give Wyoming the same satisfaction. She picked up her medical bag with both hands and looked around. The station behind her was empty, except for a weathered sign that read, Silver Creek Valley Gateway to the Western Frontier, which someone had decorated with a bullet hole directly through the word Gateway. A dog lay sleeping in the shade of the station wall, one ear twitching at flies. A boy of about 9 sat on the broken bench eating something from a folded cloth, watching her the way children watch things they are not sure whether to trust. There was no doctor. There was no wagon. There was no one holding a sign with her name on it. She opened her coat pocket and took out the letter she had read so many times, the fold lines had gone white. We are in desperate need of a trained nurse. Dr. Samuel Hayes extends his personal invitation. Accommodations provided. Compensation fair and timely. Silver Creek Valley welcomes you, Miss Bennett. Dr. Samuel Hayes. She looked at the letter. She looked at the empty station. She looked at the boy on the bench. Excuse me, she said. I'm looking for Dr. Samuel Hayes. Do you know where his clinic is? The boy stopped chewing. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has just asked where they can find a ghost. Doc Hayes is dead, he said. Died about 6 weeks ago. Fever took him fast. Clara did not move for a moment. Is there another doctor in town? She asked. Dr. Collins. But he ain't going to be happy to see you. Why not? The boy shrugged. Because you're here instead of him being enough. She walked the half-mile into town because there was nothing else to do. Silver Creek Valley was not what the letter had made it sound. The main street was packed dirt and ambition, a general store, a livery, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and old decisions, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though it had been listening to the saloon for too long and was starting to agree with it. There was a building that might have been a doctor's office once, with a faded painted window and a padlock on the door that had rusted into permanence. People looked at her as she walked. Not hostilely, more the way people look at a weather event. Curious, assessing, waiting to see what damage she might cause. She stopped in front of what appeared to be the most official building on the street, a low structure with a wooden sign reading Town Administration, which she suspected meant it was where the sheriff kept his paperwork. She pushed the door open. A man behind a desk looked up. He was in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, with a mustache that had been impressive once and had since made peace with its decline. He had a tin star on his chest and the expression of a man who had long ago calculated exactly how much trouble any given situation was going to be. Help you, he said. I'm Clara Bennett, she said. I'm a nurse. I was invited here by Dr. Samuel Hayes to work at his clinic. The sheriff, his nameplate read. Sheriff Dale Pruitt set down his pen. Doc Hayes is dead, he said. The boy at the station told me, 6 weeks ago. About that, yes. And the clinic. Never quite got built. He had plans. He kept saying he was going to get to it. Clara kept her voice even. She had practiced this, keeping her voice even, when the thing she most wanted to do was put her fist through a wall. The letter he sent me promised accommodation and compensation, she said. I know, he sent a few of those letters. Pruitt leaned back in his chair, and it made a sound like regret. He was a good man. Believed this town needed proper medical care. Wasn't wrong about that. Just ran out of time to make it happen. Is there any fund? Any arrangement the town made to honor his invitations? Pruitt looked at her with something that was almost apology. Miss Bennett, this is a frontier settlement. We're still arguing about whether we can afford to fix the church before it tips over. There's no fund. Clara set her medical bag on the floor. She opened it and looked at what was inside more for something to do with her hands than because she needed to see. Bandages. Carbolic acid. A bone saw wrapped in cloth. Instruments her mother had given her. A dog-eared copy of Gray's Anatomy. A journal filled with her handwriting dense with the notes of 11 years of practice. She closed it. Where is Dr. Collins? She asked. Dr. Walter Collins was 63 years old and had been practicing medicine in Silver Creek Valley for 22 of them. He had seen everything and fixed most of it, and he was not accustomed to being supplemented. His office was in his house, which was the second largest building in town, which he considered appropriate. He answered the door himself and looked at Clara the way a cat looks at a dog that has wandered into its yard, not afraid, but profoundly skeptical of the wisdom being demonstrated. You're the woman Hayes wrote to, he said. Clara Bennett, trained nurse, 11 years of surgical and general practice at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. Chicago, he repeated, as if the word meant something unpleasant. I'm aware that Dr. Hayes has passed and that the clinic he described was never built, Clara said. I'm not here to take your practice. I'm here because I was promised work, and I've traveled a long distance, and I intend to find something useful to do with myself. Collins folded his arms. He was a tall man, which he used the way some men use height as a form of argument. I don't need an assistant, he said. I'm not offering to be your assistant, Clara said. I'm telling you, I'm going to be in this town. If there are patients you can't reach patients, you're too busy for patients who need care between your visits. I am trained and willing, and I will not be charging anyone more than they can afford. On what authority? Human decency, she said. And the fact that I have nothing left to lose. Something shifted in his expression. A very small shift, but she caught it. He was not a cruel man. He was a territorial one. There was a difference. Where are you staying? He said. I haven't arranged that yet. He looked at her. He looked at her bag. He looked at the sky as though consulting it. Margaret Holt takes in boarders, he said. Tell her I sent you. She won't charge the first week because she still owes me for her hip. He closed the door. Clara stood on his porch for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and went to find Margaret Holt. Margaret Holt was 61, wiry, and had an opinion about everything and the confidence to share all of them. Her house was the kind of place that had absorbed 30 years of cooking smells and became something warm and dense, like bread that was always slightly warm on the inside. You're Hayes's nurse, she said before Clara had finished introducing herself. He's gone, Clara said. I know he's gone. I also know he was right that we needed someone. Collins is a good doctor, but he's one man, and he's got a bad back, and he won't admit it. She took Clara's bag from her without asking and set it inside the door. You'll have the back room. Window sticks, but it opens if you put your shoulder into it. Supper's at 6. I don't tolerate lateness, and I don't tolerate men who smell like horses at the table. So if you bring any of either into my house, I'll expect you to handle it. I don't have any men, Clara said. Not yet, Margaret said with the certainty of a woman who had read many futures and been right about most of them. 3 days into Silver Creek Valley. Clara worked. She had no clinic. She had no official standing. She had a room, a bag, and 11 years of knowledge that did not stop being useful simply because no one had given her permission to use it. Word traveled faster in a small town than Clara had expected. On the first morning, a woman named Ruth Calloway knocked on Margaret's door at 7 in the morning and said her son had been limping for 2 weeks and the pain was getting worse and she couldn't get Dr. Collins until next Tuesday. Clara looked at the boy's foot. removed a piece of broken glass that had worked itself half an inch into the sole of his heel, cleaned the wound, wrapped it properly. The boy stopped limping before he reached the end of the street. On the second day, a ranch hand named Pete came in holding his arm against his chest and not looking at her, because he had been told nurses were women and medicine was for weakness, and he hadn't decided yet which of those things to believe. Clara looked at his arm without commentary. The wound was infected 3 days past when it should have been cleaned, the kind of infection that became dangerous if it was given another 3 days. She cleaned it. She gave him instructions. She told him that infection did not care about his opinions about women, and that if he didn't follow the instructions she'd given him, she would consider it a personal failure, and she did not enjoy those. He followed the instructions. On the third day, a woman named Eliza Marsh came to the house and didn't say anything for 5 minutes, and then said she'd been bleeding in ways that didn't seem right for 3 months and hadn't told her husband or Dr. Collins because she didn't know how to say it. Clara sat with her for an hour. She asked the questions that needed to be asked. She gave the information that needed to be given. She did not make Eliza feel like a problem that needed to be managed. When Eliza left, she squeezed Clara's hand at the door and didn't say anything, and Clara understood that sometimes what a person needed more than medicine was to be heard by someone who would not flinch. By the end of the first week, the back room at Margaret Holt's house had become something that was almost in the most informal and unofficial possible sense a clinic. Not everyone in Silver Creek Valley was glad of it. The man who made his displeasure most formally known was a rancher named Gerald Briggs, who came to see Dr. Collins about a blister and used the visit to complain about the woman practicing medicine without a license. Collins sent him away with a salve and mild irritation. But the complaint spread the way complaints do in small towns, quietly, persistently through the spaces between conversations. Clara heard about it from Margaret, who heard it from the mercantile owner's wife, who had heard it from Gerald Briggs's foreman at the saloon. "He says you're going to kill someone," Margaret reported without apparent concern. "I am not going to kill anyone," Clara said. "I know that. The boy with the glass in his foot knows that. The man with the arm infection knows that." Margaret poured coffee. "Gerald Briggs doesn't actually care about you killing anyone. He cares that his wife has been coming to see you twice a week and seems happier than she's been in years, and it is not Clara Bennett I'm talking about now, it's the idea of Gerald Briggs that I'm explaining." Clara drank her coffee. "So he feels threatened," she said. "He feels irrelevant," Margaret said, "which is worse." On the 9th day, the thing happened that Clara would later understand had changed everything. She was at the Harmon farm 3 miles east of town, where an 8-year-old girl named Alice had been running a fever for 5 days. The family had told Clara it wasn't necessary to come. Alice would be fine. They'd managed fevers before Clara shouldn't trouble herself. She came anyway. She looked at Alice and knew immediately that this was not a fever that would manage itself. The child's breathing had a quality to it that Clara recognized from the hospital, a tightness, a labor. A sound that was the body working harder than it should have to do the most basic thing it did. She sat beside the child and examined her carefully. Pneumonia. Early, but real. She turned to Alice's mother, a woman named June, who had the face of someone who had learned to accept bad news quietly, because making noise about it didn't change anything. "She needs to be kept warm and kept still," Clara said. "I'm going to leave you this tincture and I need you to give her this exact amount every 4 hours. Not 3 hours, not 5. 4. And if her breathing changes, if it gets harder than what I'm hearing now, you send someone to get me immediately no matter what time it is." "Is it serious?" June asked. Clara looked at her. She had been asked this question many times by many frightened parents, and she had learned that the answer that sounded kind in the moment was not always the most useful answer. "It could become serious," she said, "which is exactly why I'm going to make sure it doesn't." She stayed for 3 hours. She came back the next morning before the town was awake. She came back again that afternoon. By the 4th day, Alice's fever was breaking. By the 6th, the child was sitting up in bed and asking her mother why the medicine smelled like socks. June Harmon walked 2 miles into town to tell people what had happened, which was how the story of the nurse and the Harmon girl started moving through Silver Creek Valley with the speed and persistence of something that had been waiting to be told. What Clara did not know when she was sitting with Alice through the worst of the fever on the third night was that she was being watched. Not in a threatening way. In the way that certain things are watched by certain people carefully, quietly, with the attention of someone who knows what they are looking at and is not sure yet what to do with the knowledge. The Harmon farm bordered the eastern edge of the largest cattle ranch in Silver Creek Valley. Walker Ranch. And Thomas Walker, who had ridden the fence line that evening, the way he did most evenings because sleep had become something that happened to other people, had seen the light in the Harmon window, and then seen a woman cross the yard in the dark to get water, and had watched without meaning to, the way she moved, purposeful, unhurried, carrying the kind of competence that is so complete it becomes invisible to itself. He had seen his wife move like that once. He turned his horse and rode back toward home, and told himself it was nothing. 2 weeks after Clara arrived in Silver Creek Valley, the accident at Randall's mill happened. She heard the bell before she understood what it meant, a clanging that cut through the afternoon air with the urgency of something that had gone very wrong. She grabbed her bag and ran. The mill was a quarter-mile outside town, and by the time she reached it, there were already 10 people standing around the entrance to the main floor, not going in with the particular stillness of people who are frightened and waiting for someone else to act first. She went in. A man named Jake Dunley had his left hand caught in the conveyor mechanism. He was conscious, which was more information than Clara wanted in that moment, because it meant he could feel everything. His foreman, a big man named Curtis, who had the look of someone who had seen a great deal of difficult things, but not this particular kind, was standing beside him, holding a piece of wood that he had apparently picked up and then put down because he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Get that mechanism stopped," Clara said immediately. "Now, not in a moment now." Curtis blinked. Then he moved. She was at Jake's side before the machine went quiet. "Look at me," she told him. "Jake, look at my face. Not at your hand. At my face." He looked at her. "Tell me your wife's name," she said, because it was the first thing she thought of anything to keep his mind from where it most wanted to go. "What?" he said. "Your wife. What's her name?" "Lucy," he said, confused enough by the question that his breathing had steadied slightly. "Good. Lucy. I'm going to take care of your hand, Jake, and I need you to keep talking to me about Lucy. Start with when you met her." She worked while he talked. She did not minimize what she was doing. The injury was serious, and she was honest about that with herself, even as she kept her expression steady and her voice calm and her hands absolutely certain. The hand was badly damaged, but the mechanism had released at the moment it stopped, and that made the difference between bad and catastrophic. She stopped the bleeding. She assessed the damage. She told Curtis exactly what she needed, and he went and got it without asking questions, because something in her voice had made asking questions irrelevant. She was in the process of wrapping the wound when she heard someone come in behind her, a presence that registered. Not because it made a sound, but because it changed something in the room. The way a change in weather changes a room before you can name what's different. She did not look up. She finished the wrap. She told Jake what he needed to do and what would happen if he didn't do it, and that Lucy was going to need to be involved in enforcing those instructions. Then she stood. The man standing behind her was tall, genuinely tall. The kind of tall that isn't about impressiveness. It's just what happened. He wore a coat that had seen years of use, and a hat that sat on his head the way a hat sits when it belongs there, not when someone put it there. His face was not young and not old, but somewhere in the long middle ground that the West seemed to produce in men who had worked it long enough. I was looking at her with an expression that Clara couldn't quite categorize. Not the wariness she'd gotten used to, not the skepticism, not the assessment. Something quieter than all of those. "That was well done," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that didn't raise itself. "It needed doing," Clara said, because she didn't know what else to say, and she was still running on the particular focused calm that followed high-pressure situations, which was not the same as actual calm, but felt like it for a few minutes. "My name is Thomas Walker," he said. "I own the ranch north of here. I have 11 workers, and the nearest I've been able to get to medical help is Dr. Collins, who comes when he can, which isn't always when something happens. Clara looked at him. He looked back. Are you asking me something? She said. I'm offering you something, he said. An arrangement. You make regular visits to Walker Ranch. I'll provide you a space to see patients properly, not a house room, a real space. And I'll pay you a fair wage for the time. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had learned in the last 2 weeks that Silver Creek Valley had layers she had not initially seen. Some of what looked like hostility was actually fear. Some of what looked like indifference was actually exhaustion. And some of what looked like simple offers were actually complicated ones. Why? She said. Thomas Walker considered the question as though he took it seriously, which Clara noticed. Because I watched what you just did, he said. And because I watched what you did for the Harmon girl. And because I've had 2 workers miss a month of work from injuries that should have been caught and treated early and weren't. And I've watched what that costs a man, not the wages, not the work. What it costs him. Something in the last part was different from the rest. All right, Clara said. All right, he said. Yes, I'll come. He nodded once. It was not a small thing, though it was a small gesture. Monday morning, he said. I'll send a wagon. He left without ceremony, which Clara would later understand was simply how he did things. She stood in the mill with her bag in her hands, and the sound of Jake Dunley telling Curtis that Lucy was going to say she'd told him so, which was true, and she thought about the quiet in Thomas Walker's voice when he had said what it costs a man, and she thought that there was something in those words that was not entirely about workers and wages. But she didn't let herself think about it too long. She had packing to do before Monday. That evening, Clara sat at Margaret Holt's kitchen table and wrote in her journal. 11 days in Silver Creek Valley. No clinic. No official standing. 3 difficult cases. 1 near disaster at the mill. 1 arrangement that I do not fully understand, but which feels despite everything like something solid. Gerald Briggs says I will kill someone. Dr. Collins says nothing, which is either respect or strategy, and I'm not certain which. The town is watching me the way you watch a tightrope walker, hoping for the performance braced for the fall. I am not going to fall. I did not come this far to fall. She closed the journal. Margaret set a plate of something warm in front of her and sat down across the table and said, Thomas Walker came by while you were at the mill. Clara looked up. He came by here. To tell me what happened, to make sure I knew you were all right. Margaret looked at her plate. He didn't say that was why, of course. He said he wanted to let me know the mill accident had been handled. He saw me at the mill, Clara said. I know, he told me. A pause. He used the word impressive and then looked annoyed at himself for using it, which I found more interesting than the word itself. Clara ate her supper. She didn't say anything. Margaret didn't say anything either. Some things they had both learned in their different ways did not need to be said out loud to be heard. Sunday night. Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the back room at Margaret's with the window cracked. She'd gotten the trick of it, the shoulder into the frame push that Margaret had described, and listened to Silver Creek Valley settle into its nighttime sounds. She thought about Chicago. She thought about the morning she had walked into the office of the hospital administrator and told him what Dr. Mercer had done. The records he'd altered, the prescriptions he'd written incorrectly. The patient who had died from a dose that was wrong by a factor she still couldn't look at without her hands going cold. She thought about the way the administrator had listened, the way he had nodded, the way he had said he would look into it, and the way, 1 week later, he had called her into his office and told her that Dr. Mercer had been a valued member of the hospital for 27 years, and that her allegations, while perhaps stemming from genuine concern, could not be substantiated, and that it might be better for everyone if Clara pursued her career elsewhere. Elsewhere. As though she were a weather system. As though the solution to a nurse who told the truth was to send her west until she became someone else's problem. She had spent 3 months believing she would never work again. She had spent 3 months reading letters that didn't come, and watching her savings diminish, and sitting in her apartment in Chicago, where the walls were thin and she could hear her neighbor practicing piano badly, the same piece over and over, never getting to the end of it. Then, Hayes's letter had come, and she had thought, This is the direction I go. She had been wrong about Hayes, wrong about the clinic, wrong about the promise. But she was not wrong about the direction. She knew that now. Lying in a room in Margaret Holt's house in Silver Creek Valley, Wyoming territory, listening to the sounds of a town she had arrived in broke and alone, and which had slowly, stubbornly, in the way that small towns make space for things they didn't know they needed, begun to make room for her. She would go to Walker Ranch on Monday. She would do the work that needed doing. And she would not under any circumstances spend time thinking about the way Thomas Walker had said the word costs, as though it were something he carried personally. She was here to heal people, not to be healed herself. She told herself this firmly, the way she had told Jake Dunley to look at her face instead of his hand. She fell asleep just before dawn with the window letting in a breeze that smelled like grass and distance and the particular western dark that was. She had to admit nothing at all like Chicago. Which was, she thought, exactly the point. In Silver Creek Valley, the summer of 1887 was the summer everything shifted. A woman arrived with a medical bag and nothing else, and she found a town that didn't know it was waiting for her. A cowboy rode his fence lines every night and tried not to remember what it felt like to be someone who still believed in things. And between the two of them, on a dusty Monday morning, when a wagon arrived at Margaret Holt's door, exactly when it was supposed to, something began. Something neither of them had a name for yet. But the kind of thing that once started does not stop. The wagon arrived at Margaret Holt's door at 7 in the morning, exactly when Thomas Walker said it would. Clara had been ready since 6. She would not have admitted that to anyone, but she had been sitting at Margaret's kitchen table with her bag packed and her coat buttoned, since the light was still gray, drinking coffee she didn't need, and pretending to read a page of Gray's Anatomy she had already memorized in 1879. The driver was a young man named Eli, 19, freckled with the cheerful energy of someone who had not yet been worn down by enough mornings. He jumped off the wagon bench when he saw her coming and took her bag with both hands before she could say she didn't need help with it. "Mr. Walker sent me to fetch the nurse," he said. "I'm the nurse," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am, that's why I'm fetching you." Margaret appeared in the doorway behind her. She had her arms folded, and her expression was the one she used when she was saying nothing so loudly that it functioned as a full paragraph. "Be back for supper," she said. "I don't know how long this will take," Clara said. "I know. Be back for supper anyway." Clara climbed up onto the wagon bench, and Eli clicked his tongue at the horses, and they moved, and Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead, and did not look back at the doorway, because she knew Margaret was still standing there watching, wearing the expression of a woman who had already decided how this story ended and was simply waiting for the characters to catch up. The ride to Walker Ranch took 20 minutes. Clara used them to organize her thoughts, which was what she called the practice of telling herself firmly what she was going to do and what she was not going to do and what certain things definitely did not mean. She was going to assess the health needs of 11 workers on a working cattle ranch. She was not going to be distracted by the quiet in a man's voice when he said certain words, and the fact that Thomas Walker had sent the wagon at exactly the time he'd said, and that Eli had jumped off the bench to carry her bag. These things meant nothing except basic courtesy, and she was not going to construct anything out of basic courtesy. She had done that before in Chicago, with a man who had also been courteous and careful, and who had ultimately declined to say a single word in her defense when it mattered most. She had learned things from that. She intended to keep learning them. Walker Ranch was larger than she had imagined from the description, not just the land which went in every direction, with the unself-conscious confidence of land that had never been told. It should be smaller, but the organization of it. There was a logic to how things were laid out, an efficiency that told her whoever had built this had thought not just about what was needed now, but what would be needed later. Thomas Walker was standing in front of the main building when the wagon came in. He had clearly been doing something. There was dust on his coat, and he'd pushed his hat back on his head, the way men do when they've been bent over a task. But he straightened when the wagon stopped and came forward. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Walker." He looked at her bag. "Eli, take that for you." "He tried," Clara said. "I let him." Something moved in Thomas Walker's expression. It might have been amusement. It was very controlled, but it was there. "I've set up a space in the infirmary building," he said. "It's not much, used to be storage, but it's clean and there's light. Can I see it before we start?" He led her there without commentary. She walked through and looked at everything with the assessing eye she had developed in 11 years of working in spaces that were never quite right and had to be made to work anyway. Table, light, water access, shelves. "This will do," she said. "I thought you might want more time to decide," he said. "I've worked in worse," she said. "I've worked in a barn. I've worked in a kitchen with a woman going into labor on the table and a pot of beans still cooking on the stove. This is clean and it has good light. It will do." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "I'll send the men in." "Tell me about them first," Clara said. "What I'm walking into." He stopped. He turned back. And she saw for the first time that he had not expected that she would want information before action, that she was treating this the way a good doctor treats any situation, gathering knowledge before making decisions. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me who needs help and why and what they've been told they should just live with." He sat. He talked. She listened and wrote. By the time the first worker came through the door, Clara had 4 pages of notes and a clearer picture of Walker Ranch's medical history than Dr. Collins had likely compiled in years. The first man through the door was named Roy Sutter, 61 years old, who had been told his knee was just age and there was nothing to be done about it. Clara spent 40 minutes with Roy Sutter. When he left, he was walking differently. Not perfectly. The damage was real and old, but with information he hadn't had before about how to manage it, what to avoid, and 2 specific exercises that would strengthen the muscles around the joint and reduce the worst of the pain. "How long has your knee been like this?" Clara had asked him. "About 4 years," he said. "And in 4 years, no one showed you this." She demonstrated the positioning. "Doc Collins said there wasn't anything to do." "Dr. Collins isn't wrong that the damage is permanent," Clara said, keeping her voice even. "But permanent damage doesn't mean unchangeable pain. These are different things." Roy Sutter looked at her with the careful eyes of a man who had been disappointed by medicine before and was not ready to be disappointed again. "You sure about that?" he said. "I'm sure that if you do what I'm showing you for 3 weeks and it makes no difference, I'll tell you honestly and we'll think of something else," she said. "But I'd like the 3 weeks." He nodded. He came back the following week and told her the stairs didn't hurt the same way. She wrote it in her journal that night and felt the particular satisfaction that never got old, no matter how many times it happened. The satisfaction of a person walking better than they walked before you saw them. The second man was a young hand named Daniel Cho, 24, who had a cough he'd been ignoring for 2 months. Clara listened to his chest. She asked him questions. She looked at him the way she looked at everything directly without flinching, gathering information. "How long have you been sleeping badly?" she asked. He looked startled. "I didn't say I was sleeping badly. No. But you have the face of someone who's been waking up at night and not knowing why, and when you take a deep breath, you do this." She demonstrated the almost imperceptible pulling. She'd noticed the slight hesitation before full inflation. "It's just a cough," he said. "It's a cough that started as something else and became a habit. The lungs developed to manage something they're dealing with," Clara said. "I'm not telling you it's catastrophic. I'm telling you it's worth paying attention to." She gave him instructions. A preparation to make and take twice a day. A position for sleeping. What to watch for and what warranted coming back immediately. He looked at her when he was leaving. "How did you know?" he said. "About the sleeping." "Because I've seen 100 coughs," Clara said. "And each of them tells a story if you know how to listen." He left, looking like someone who had been seen, which was different from someone who had been examined. By midday, Clara had seen 6 men. Thomas Walker appeared in the doorway of the infirmary at noon with 2 plates of food, which he set on the table without ceremony. "Sit down," he said. "You've been at this since 8. "I have two more after lunch," Clara said. "I know, sit down anyway." She sat. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Clara had been in enough silences with enough people to know the difference between the kind that came from having nothing to say and the kind that came from not needing to fill every moment with noise. This was the second kind. "Roy Sutter looked different when he left," Thomas said eventually. "He's been managing avoidable pain for 4 years," Clara said. Collins said, "I know what Collins said. Collins is not wrong about the damage. He may not have had the time or the inclination to go further than the damage." Thomas was quiet. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. Clara waited. "She had a pain in her side for 8 months before she told me," he said. "By the time Collins saw her, it was too late to do much. She was gone inside of 4 months after that." He said it the way someone says something they have said before, only inside their own head, where the words have been repeated so many times they've worn smooth. Not performatively. Not as a bid for sympathy. Just the way things are said when they are simply true. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "She kept it from me because she didn't want to worry me," he said. "I've spent 3 years thinking about what would have happened if she'd told someone earlier. If someone had asked the right questions." "You can't know that," Clara said gently. "No," he said. "But I think about it." He picked up his fork. The subject was closed, not because it was finished, but because that was all he was willing to carry out of himself at one time, and Clara understood that. She ate her lunch. She thought that Thomas Walker was a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had gotten so used to the weight that he no longer bent under it visibly. She knew the feeling. The afternoon brought the man Clara had been warned about. His name was Frank Hollis, 47 Walker Ranch's head foreman, and he arrived in the doorway of the infirmary with his hat in his hands and an expression that said he was here under protest and wanted that understood from the outset. "Mr. Walker told me to come," he said. "I know," Clara said. "Come in." "I don't need a woman looking me over," he said. "Then we have something in common," Clara said, not looking up from where she was organizing her instruments. "Because I don't need a man telling me what he does and doesn't need before I've had the chance to find out. Sit down, Mr. Hollis." A pause. He sat. She examined him methodically and found, which did not surprise her, exactly what she had expected to find in a man of his age and type, who had been doing physical labor for decades and telling himself he was fine. A shoulder that had been dislocated at least once and not properly reset, which was why his right arm moved 3 degrees differently from his left. A set of ribs on the left side that had healed from a break at some point in the not-too-distant past, at a slight angle, which was why he unconsciously favored that side when he turned. And blood pressure that was high enough to be concerning and low enough to be deniable. She told him all of this. He sat very still while she talked. "The shoulder," he said. "How did you know about the shoulder?" "The way you reached for your hat when you came in," she said. "Your right arm does it differently. It doesn't hurt much. It doesn't hurt much right now. That's different from it being fine." He looked at the floor. Then he looked at her. "Is it fixable?" he said. "Partially," she said. "There are things I can show you that will help considerably. There are things that are set now the way they're set. I'll be honest with you about which is which." Another silence. "All right," he said. "All right. Tell me." She told him. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. When he left, he paused in the doorway. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who needed proving to," he said. "Someone who needed the work. You just do it." "Yes," Clara said simply. "Why?" She thought about it. "Because it needs doing," she said. "And because every person who sits in that chair is telling me something that matters. The least I can do is hear it." He nodded once very slightly and left. Clara sat alone in the infirmary for 3 minutes, which was all she allowed herself, and let the accumulated weight of the day move through her. All the stories, all the pain, all the things people had been carrying alone and hadn't known they could set down. Then she picked up her pen and started writing notes. Thomas Walker found her there at 5 o'clock, still writing. "I thought you'd be done by now," he said. "I'm doing my notes while it's fresh," she said. "I'll remember more accurately now than tomorrow." He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything for a while. "Frank Hollis," he said. "He'll be all right," Clara said. "The shoulder is manageable. The ribs are what they are. The blood pressure is the thing I'm going to watch. He's never let Collins near him." "I know. So how did you—" "I didn't give him time to decide," Clara said. "And I didn't ask for permission before I started looking. Some men, if you ask them first, will say no on principle. If you simply begin, they have to decide to stop you, and most of them won't." Thomas looked at her. "Is that a tactic?" "It's a truth about human beings," she said. "We resist the idea of being helped more than we resist the help itself usually. Once someone is already helping, the resistance softens." Howe was quiet. She capped her pen and looked at him directly. "What is it?" she said. "I'm trying to figure out," he said slowly, "whether you learned that from medicine or from something else." Clara held his gaze. "From 11 years of trying to do a job in a world that spent most of its energy trying to tell me I shouldn't be doing it," she said. "You learn to begin before they can stop you." The silence that followed was different from the lunchtime silence Fuller somehow waited in a way that Clara was aware of, but did not examine too closely. "Well," Thomas said. "Same time next week." "Same time next week," she said. He walked her to the wagon where Eli was already waiting. Before she climbed up, she turned. "Mr. Walker." "Thomas," he said. She paused. "Thomas, what you told me at lunch about your wife. You were right to tell me. Not because it changes anything about what I'm doing here, but because it's the reason you do things the way you do, and I should understand that." He didn't say anything. "I'm not her," Clara said. "And I'm not going to let the same thing happen to the people I see here. That's all." She climbed up. Eli clicked his tongue and the horses moved. She did not look back. But she was fairly certain from the particular quality of the silence behind her that Thomas Walker stood in that yard for longer than was strictly necessary. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Monday mornings, Clara came to Walker Ranch. She treated injuries. She caught problems early. She argued occasionally and successfully with men who believed toughness meant ignoring pain. The rest of the week she worked from Margaret's house and the expanding informal network of people who had learned that Clara Bennett would come when called and would treat them with competence and dignity and charge them what they could afford, which was sometimes very little and sometimes nothing. Dr. Collins remained a constant, not hostile exactly, but watchful. He came to her once in the third week to ask her opinion on a case he was not sure about. He framed it as showing her something, not asking her, but the meaning was the same. She gave him her opinion directly and without hedging. He used it. He did not thank her explicitly, but he also did not tell Gerald Briggs to stop complaining, and Gerald Briggs had not stopped complaining. The complaints had taken on a new form now. Less about her killing someone since nobody had died. More about the principle of the thing that a woman with no local license, no permanent clinic, no standing was practicing medicine and being allowed to do so. Clara heard about each new version of the complaint from Margaret, who heard it from everyone, because Margaret had long ago made herself the central point of information for Silver Creek Valley, in a way that was so natural, nobody had thought to resist it. "Briggs talked to the county office," Margaret said one morning. Clara set down her coffee. "What did the county office say?" "That there's no formal complaint lodged, that a complaint would need to come from a licensed physician." A pause. "Collins hasn't lodged one." "I know he won't," Clara said. "He's frustrated and territorial, but he's not dishonest." "He saw the Marsh girl at the Davis house last week," Margaret said. "The girl with the bad cough who everyone said was just like her mother. Collins saw what you'd written in your notes Eliza showed him, and he changed his treatment. She's better." Clara was quiet. "He didn't say anything to you about it?" Margaret asked. "No. He's a proud man." "I know. But he's a doctor first." "Yes," Clara said. "I've been counting on that." It was during the fourth week that the thing happened, which Clara would later describe in her journal as the moment she understood Thomas Walker was not who she had initially thought he was. She had classified him in her practical way as a decent man with appropriate motivations who had hired her for functional reasons. She had not classified him as someone who noticed things. She was wrong about that. She had been at the ranch on a Monday, working through the morning as usual, when she heard shouting from the direction of the eastern pasture. Not the ordinary shouting of men, working the specific quality of urgency that meant something had gone badly. She grabbed her bag and went. 2 horses had gotten into the fence wire. In the process of separating them, a young hand named Thomas, barely 18, still in the stage of trying to seem older, had taken a kick to the chest that had put him on the ground. When Clara got there, he was sitting up, which was good. His breathing was the problem. She knelt beside him in the dirt. "Look at me," she said. "Tomas, right here." He looked at her. His eyes were frightened in the way that young men's eyes get frightened when they are genuinely hurt and cannot hide it. "Does it hurt more when you breathe in or when you breathe out?" she asked. "Both," he managed. "Scale, 1 to 10. 7. "Good," she said, because 7 meant pain and not shock, and she needed him in pain right now rather than past it. "You're going to be all right. I need you to take very small breaths, not deep small like you're sipping air." She examined him quickly, efficiently. 2 ribs. Bruised, possibly 1 cracked. Lungs intact. She listened and heard what she needed to hear. Painful, but not dangerous if managed. She looked up and found Thomas Walker standing 3 feet away. He had not told her how to do it. He had not crowded her. He had not asked questions. He had made space and was waiting. Around them, 4 other men stood in a loose ring. She looked at them. "Someone get me a flat board from the barn, not too wide, about this long." She indicated with her hands. "And someone else get water and a cloth." They moved immediately. She had not said please. She had not said would you mind. She had simply said do this, and the confidence in her voice had made it a given. When she looked back at Thomas, he was watching her with the expression she had seen at the mill, the one she had not quite been able to name. "He'll need to stay off horses for 3 weeks," she said to him directly, because he was the employer and decisions needed to be made. "And no heavy lifting. He can do light work if the pain is manageable, but if it sharpens or he gets a fever, I need to know immediately." "Understood," Thomas said. She helped settle Thomas onto the board with the careful hands of someone who knew exactly where the damage was. "You'll be all right," she told him. "You said that already," he said with the ghost of pride that young men use to get themselves through frightening moments. "I know. I meant it both times." She stayed another hour to make sure his breathing stabilized. Thomas stayed nearby, working, not hovering, doing things that needed doing in the vicinity, in the way a person does when they want to be close without making it obvious they want to be close. When Tomas was settled and comfortable, and Clara was packing her bag, Thomas said quietly, "You didn't hesitate." "There wasn't time to hesitate," she said. "There's always time," he said. "Most people find it anyway. You didn't." She looked at him. "Do you hesitate?" she asked. He considered it. "Less than I used to," he said. "What changed?" "Learning what hesitation costs," he said. She thought she understood that. More than she wanted to admit, she thought she understood exactly that. The thing about Walker Ranch was that it was starting to feel in small increments that Clara monitored with the same professional attention she gave everything like a place she belonged. That was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. She had belonged somewhere, once had been part of St. Mary's in the deep structural way that people become part of institutions, where your rhythms align with the institution's rhythms, and you stop noticing because it simply is. And then she had stopped belonging there very suddenly, and the cut of it had been worse than she'd expected, not because she hadn't expected to be cut, but because she hadn't realized how much of her sense of herself had been held up by the belonging. She would not make that mistake again. She would be useful. She would be good at her work. She would appreciate the arrangement and the people and the particular way the light came into the infirmary in the afternoon. She would not let it become necessary. She told herself this on the 5th Monday, riding out to the ranch on the wagon bench beside Eli, who was explaining a complicated situation involving his sweetheart and her father's opinion of his prospects. "What do you think?" Eli said. "About your prospects," Clara said. "About whether I should say something directly or wait for her to—" "Say something directly," Clara said. "Always. Waiting for circumstances to arrange themselves is how people spend years not getting what they want." Eli thought about it. "Is that from medicine?" he asked. "It's from watching a great number of people make a great number of avoidable mistakes," she said. Eli nodded seriously. Clara looked at the road ahead, and when Walker Ranch came into view, the buildings, the sounds, the particular organized life of the place, she felt something move in her chest that she identified carefully and accurately as warmth, and she told it firmly that it was not allowed to become anything more than warmth, and the warmth paid no attention to her at all. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Margaret brought it to Clara with a face that gave nothing away, which was itself information, because Margaret's face gave something away about almost everything. It had come from a law office in Cheyenne. It was addressed to Miss Clara Bennett, care of Silver Creek Valley. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. It was from an attorney named Morrison, representing a man named Charles Whitmore, who was Morrison's letter explained in the careful language of legal threats dressed as courtesy, a prominent businessman and property owner with significant interests throughout Wyoming Territory. Mr. Whitmore, the letter continued, had become aware that a Miss Clara Bennett was operating as a medical practitioner in Silver Creek Valley without proper territorial licensure. Mr. Whitmore, as a concerned citizen with deep investment in the welfare and proper functioning of Wyoming Territory communities, wished to draw Miss Bennett's attention to the relevant territorial statutes regarding unlicensed medical practice, and to advise her that continued operation without proper credentialing could result in formal complaint proceedings. Mr. Whitmore wished Miss Bennett to know that this was offered in the spirit of helpful guidance, and that he hoped she would take appropriate steps at her earliest convenience. Clara read the letter twice. She set it down. She looked at it. "Who is Charles Whitmore?" she said. Margaret, who had apparently been waiting for this question, sat down. "That," Margaret said, "is the question most people in this valley are afraid to ask out loud." Clara looked at her. "Then I think," Clara said carefully, "that you need to tell me everything." And the warmth she had been carefully managing all morning disappeared, entirely replaced by something sharper and older and much more familiar. The particular clarity she got when she understood that someone powerful had just pointed themselves in her direction. She had been here before. She was not the same person she had been the last time. And she was this time not standing alone. Margaret told her everything. It took the better part of an hour, 2 cups of coffee, and one moment where Margaret stopped and looked at her hands for a long time before she continued, which told Clara more than the words did about how serious the situation was. Charles Whitmore had arrived in Silver Creek Valley 18 months ago. Not in-person men, like Whitmore, rarely arrived in person. He had arrived through a representative named Doyle, who came with a handsome wagon and a good suit and a very pleasant manner, and a briefcase full of papers that he was happy to explain to anyone who had the time to listen. The papers were loan agreements. The terms were straightforward, as Doyle explained them. Struggling ranch families in the valley could access capital against the value of their land. The interest rates were reasonable at first glance. The repayment schedules were manageable at first reading. The penalty clauses were buried in language that assumed the reader had been to law school, and most of the people signing had not been to law school, and several of them had not been to much school at all. Over 18 months, 6 families in Silver Creek Valley had signed Whitmore's loan agreements. 2 had already lost parcels of land when they couldn't meet the accelerated repayment terms. Whitmore's office invoked on technical grounds that were in the paperwork, but that Doyle had never mentioned during the signing. 3 more were behind on payments and receiving letters from Morrison's office in Cheyenne that grew progressively less friendly. The 6th family, the Calloways, whose son Clara had treated on her first morning in town, had received a letter last week informing them that their eastern 40 acres were subject to immediate claim due to a clause in their agreement that Ruth Calloway had not known existed. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Clara said. Margaret looked at her. "Like what?" "These are legal documents. A lawyer in Cheyenne, a businessman nobody here has ever met. Sheriff Pruitt says his hands are tied. Collins says it's not his domain. The men who signed those papers feel like fools, and they're not eager to advertise that. But they know what's happening, Clara said. Knowing and being able to do something about it are different things, Margaret said. You of all people should understand that. Clara was quiet. She understood that precisely. And Whitmore sent me a letter, she said, about my licensure. Because you're becoming someone people trust, Margaret said. And Whitmore doesn't want trusted people in this valley. He wants people who are frightened and isolated and feel like they have no one to turn to. Clara looked at the letter on the table. He thinks warning me off will work, she said. Won't it? Margaret said. Clara picked up the letter. She folded it very neatly, the way she folded everything with the precision of someone who respected the physical world enough to handle it carefully. She put it in her coat pocket. I need to go to Walker Ranch, she said. Margaret nodded, as though this was exactly what she had expected. I'll saddle the mare, she said. Thomas Walker was in the yard when Clara arrived. He was talking to Frank Hollis. Both of them bent over something on a fence post, and he looked up when he heard hooves, and his expression shifted. Not alarm, but the rapid readiness of a man whose instincts had been calibrated by years of things going wrong at inconvenient times. He knew from her face that something had happened. Give us a minute, he told Frank. Frank looked at Clara. Then he walked away without being told twice, which told Clara something about both men. She dismounted and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. The only movement was a small tightening around his jaw halfway through that she would have missed if she hadn't been watching for it. He finished. He handed it back. How much do you know about Whitmore? He said. Margaret told me this morning. The loans, the families, the Callaways. Thomas turned. He walked a few steps and stopped. He's been after my land for 8 months, he said. Clara stared at him. What? Didn't use Doyle for mine. Came through a different channel, a man named Reeves, who represents himself as a property assessor. He's been suggesting in various ways that the territorial water rights attached to Walker Ranch are legally ambiguous, and that someone with the right legal resources could challenge them successfully. He paused. Whitmore has the legal resources. And you haven't told anyone? I told Pruitt. Pruitt told me it was a civil matter. But you knew about the other families. I suspected there was a connection. I didn't have proof. He looked at her. And I didn't know who to tell who could do something with it rather than just knowing it. Clara took a breath. That letter to me is a mistake on his part, she said. Thomas looked at her. He's showing his hand, she continued. If I were just a nurse treating ranch hands, I'm not worth his attention. But if I'm becoming connected to the community, if people trust me, talk to me, tell me things, then I become a problem for him. He's afraid of what I might find out. A pause. Have you found something out? Thomas said slowly. I treat every family in this valley who lets me come, Clara said. I've been in their homes. I've sat at their tables. And I have very good ears. She held his gaze. The Harmon family mentioned a payment they made, she said, to a man who came to settle an outstanding account on their lease. But they don't have a lease, they own their land outright. They paid because the man had a document with their names on it, and they didn't understand what they were looking at. Thomas went very still. That's not a loan default, he said. No, Clara said. That's something else. How much did they pay? $60, every dollar they had saved for the winter. The silence stretched. Ruth Calloway told me something too, Clara said quietly. When I first came, when I treated her son. She talked while I worked the way people do. She mentioned that a man had come to their house before Doyle before any papers were signed. Just to talk. Just to get to know the neighbors, he said. She stopped. He knew things about their finances that he shouldn't have known. Things you'd only know if you'd seen their accounts. Someone's been accessing bank records, Thomas said, or someone at the bank is sharing them. Another silence, longer this time. Whitmore has a business relationship with the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, Thomas said. His voice was flat, in the way voices go flat when a person is controlling something. How do you know that? Because Reeves mentioned it, in passing. The way people mention things when they want you to understand power without stating it outright. Clara looked at him. We need to find the other families, she said. Everyone who's had any contact with Doyle or Reeves or anyone connected to Whitmore. And we need to hear what they remember. Every detail. Clara. He said her name for the first time, and she felt the shift in it. The weight of a first name rather than a title. If Whitmore finds out we're gathering that information, he won't send another letter. He'll do something with more force. I know. You've been through something like this before. Yes. In Chicago, you were alone. Yes. He held her gaze. You're not alone now, he said. It was a simple sentence, 4 words. He said it the way he said everything, without ornamentation, without drama. Just the way things were said when they were simply true. Clara felt something happen in her chest that she was not equipped to deal with at the present moment and firmly postponed. All right, she said. Then let's begin. They began on a Thursday. Thomas knew the ranching families, had known most of them for years, had worked alongside some of them, had bought cattle from others. He had the quiet trust of a man who had been consistently reliable over a long period. When Thomas Walker came to talk, people listened not because he was wealthy, but because he was known. Clara knew the families differently. She knew them from the inside, from the angle of people who had let her into their homes when something hurt. She knew Ruth Calloway's particular courage, and June Harmon's quiet intelligence, and the way old Hector Vasquez, who ran a small horse operation east of town, kept his important papers in a tobacco tin behind the kitchen stove, because he'd never fully trusted banks. They divided the work. Thomas spoke to the men about land and money and what had been signed. Clara spoke to the women, and the women, as they almost always did, knew more than their husbands believed they did. They had read more carefully, had noticed more, had kept small details alive in memory, with the vigilance of people who understood that details were what you held on to when the large things were taken. Within a week, they had a picture. It was not a clean picture. It was the kind of picture that assembled itself from fragments, a phrase remembered here, a document glimpsed there, a transaction recalled with the particular accuracy of someone who had been confused and frightened at the time, and the confusion had fixed the memory like a pin through a specimen. But it was enough of a picture to see the shape. Whitmore's scheme had 3 components. The first was the loan's legitimate informed predatory in design, structured to fail at the first missed payment through penalty clauses that most borrowers had not understood. The second was the informal payments, the men like the one who had come to the Harmons collecting money on the basis of documents that may or may not have been genuine from people who were too frightened of legal consequences to ask. The third was the water rights. This was the largest element and the most carefully constructed. Wyoming territory law was complex on the matter of water rights attached to ranch land, and Whitmore, through Reeves, and through his relationship with the Cheyenne Bank, appeared to be building a case that several of the valley's most significant water sources were legally attributable to land he was in the process of acquiring. If he established that claim, the ranching families who depended on those water sources would have to pay him for access or lose their ability to operate. It was not loud theft. It was patient, legal-looking, document-by-document encirclement, and it had been going on for long enough that the people being encircled were only now beginning to understand the shape of the fence being built around them. Clara wrote everything in her journal, in the close, precise handwriting she used for medical notes, the same discipline, the same attention to detail, the same understanding that what was recorded accurately could be used, and what was only remembered was fragile. She wrote names, dates, amounts, the phrases people had used, the documents they described, the men who had come, and what they had said, and how they had said it. And Thomas, who she had not expected to be methodical, turned out to be extremely methodical. He had the land records. He had kept records of his own interactions with Reeves. He had, and this surprised her, saved every letter that had come from Whitmore's direction in a box in his office, because something in his instincts had told him they might matter. "You've been preparing for this," she said the night they spread everything on his kitchen table. "I've been waiting," he said. I didn't know what for. For someone to help you do something with it. He looked at the papers. For someone who knew how to fight this kind of fight. Clara thought about St. Mary's, about the administrator's office, about the careful, correct, completely ineffective complaint she had filed, and the way it had been used against her. I didn't win the last time I fought this kind of fight, she said. I know, Thomas said. You told me what happened in Chicago, and I noticed that you came to Wyoming anyway, that you stayed anyway, that you kept helping people anyway. He paused. That's not the behavior of someone who lost. That's the behavior of someone who learned something. Clara looked at him. Sometimes people said things that hit something deep and real in a way they probably didn't know, and the only honest response was silence, so she was silent. Thomas, to his credit, did not fill the silence. After a moment, she said, We need to know if the documents are real. The ones used with the Harmon family. If those were fraudulent, if someone used forged paperwork to extract money, then this stops being a matter of predatory lending and becomes criminal. Can we prove they're forged? Hector Vasquez told me something, Clara said. He saw the man who came to the Harmons. He was outside when the man arrived. He didn't say anything at the time because he didn't think it was his business. She paused. He described the document the man carried. He read part of it. Hector reads well, he just doesn't talk about it, and he said the seal on it wasn't the county seal. He'd seen the county seal on his own deed, and this one was different. Thomas went very still. He's sure. He's 81 years old and has been looking at details his entire life, because details are what keep horses and men alive, Clara said. He's sure. Thomas sat back. That's a crime, he said quietly. Yes. And if Whitmore is connected to the man who did it even indirectly, it puts a different shape on everything else. We need a lawyer. We need an honest lawyer, Clara said, which is a more specific requirement. Thomas almost smiled. It was very slight, but it was there. I know a man in Laramie, he said. James Alcott. He's worked property cases in the territory for 15 years. He's not connected to Cheyenne. Can you trust him? He hates injustice the way some men hate snakes, Thomas said. It's visceral with him. I've seen it. Write to him, Clara said. Tonight. Tonight. He nodded once. Then he looked at her across the table full of papers. Clara. Yes. What Whitmore's office sent you the letter about your licensure. That wasn't a warning. That was a test to see if you'd leave. I know. Now that you haven't, he'll escalate. I know that too. What he did to you in Chicago, the way they discredited you before you could be believed, he'll try something similar. Clara looked at the papers on the table. I've thought about that, she said. And, in Chicago, the only thing I had was my word against a man with 27 years of institutional protection. She looked up. Here I have documents. I have witnesses. I have names and dates and a pattern that tells its own story. A pause. And I have you. He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said simply. You do. The following Monday, Clara arrived at Walker Ranch to find that someone had been through the infirmary. Nothing had been taken. That was the first and most frightening thing, not the mess, which was considerable, but the absence of theft. Someone had come to look, not to steal, to look for what she kept there. She stood in the doorway and felt the cold clarity of understanding land on her like cold water. Her medical notes were still there, her instruments, her supplies. But her journal, the one she kept at the ranch, the one with the specific notes about the families she'd been treating, was not where she'd left it. She had moved it on Friday. She had put it under the mattress in the corner where Tomas had recovered from his rib injury, because she had had a feeling, the kind of feeling she'd learned not to dismiss, that something was shifting. The person who searched had found the spot where the journal had been, not where it was. She stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then she went to find Thomas. She found him in the yard, already aware that something was wrong. Frank Hollis had come to him first. The infirmary, she said. I know. Frank found it this morning. My journal. Is it safe? I moved it Friday. She watched the tension in his jaw change from acute to something more manageable. "Someone was looking for what you've written," he said. "Yes. Which means someone knows I've been writing things down. Which means someone in this valley is telling Whitmore's people what I'm doing." Thomas looked at her. "Or watching," he said. "Someone in the valley who Whitmore is paying to watch." The implication landed between them. "Any of the families we talked to," Clara said carefully. "Any of them could be in debt to Whitmore, afraid of him, willing to trade information to protect themselves. We can't know who." "No," Thomas said. "Not yet." Clara thought about the families she'd sat with, the conversations, the careful trust that had been built over weeks. She thought about the possibility that one of those conversations had been reported back, that someone behind a frightened face had been calculating what they could safely pass along. The thought made her tired in a specific way, not hopeless, but weathered. This was how power protected itself. Not with open force, not first, with infiltration, with doubt, with the slow erosion of the trust that made resistance possible. She had seen it before. "We move faster," she said. "What? We've been gathering. We need to stop gathering and start building the case. Whatever we have now, we give to Alcott. We don't wait until it's complete, because it may never be complete, and while we're waiting, Whitmore is moving." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "I sent the letter to Alcott Thursday," he said. "He replied yesterday. He's coming Friday." Clara blinked. "You wrote to him before we talked about it." "The same night you said to write, yes. You already knew what we needed to do." "I knew we needed to move," he said. "I didn't know if you'd agree." "And if I hadn't?" The question hung in the air between them for a moment. "Then I would have made the case," he said, "until you did." There was something in that, not stubbornness, not arrogance. The certainty of a man who believed in what they were doing, and in the person he was doing it with. Clara had not been believed in that specifically for a very long time. It felt different from what she remembered. Steadier. "All right," she said. "Friday." "Friday," he agreed. He paused. "Clara, you should know if Whitmore's found out we're looking into him, and if he's willing to have someone break into the infirmary, then he's not going to stop at a letter next time." She met his eyes. "I know," she said. "You could still—" "Thomas." She stopped him. "Don't." He stopped. "Don't tell me I could still leave," she said. "I couldn't. Not because of stubbornness. Because Ruth Calloway is going to lose her eastern 40 acres if nobody does anything. Because Hector Vasquez trusted me with something he hasn't told anyone else. Because the Harmon family paid $60 they couldn't afford to a man carrying a forged document." She held his gaze. "Because I have been run out of one place by a powerful man who counted on me being alone, and I am not alone this time, and I will not give Charles Whitmore the satisfaction of deciding who I am and where I go." Silence. Thomas Walker looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first time she'd seen him look at her at the mill when she'd been working, when he thought she couldn't see him. The way someone looks at something they recognize and didn't expect to find. "No," he said quietly. "You won't." And then Frank Hollis appeared from around the corner of the barn and said that Eli had found horse tracks near the eastern fence that didn't belong to any of their animals, and the moment shifted into something practical and urgent, and they both moved toward it, the way they had each learned to move toward urgent things, without hesitation together. James Alcott arrived on Friday. He was 50, gray beard, and the eyes of a man who had been lied to professionally for 30 years and had developed a sophisticated system for detecting it. He wore a good coat and carried a leather satchel that had seen serious use, and when Thomas introduced Clara, he shook her hand the way people shake hands when they are not thinking about the handshake, firmly, briefly, moving directly on to what mattered. "You're the one who's been documenting," he said to her. "Yes," she said. "Let me see it." She put the journal on Thomas's kitchen table, open to the pages she had flagged, and Alcott read. He did not speak while he read. He made small sounds occasionally, not reactions, just evidence of continued breathing, and he turned pages with the careful speed of someone who was reading everything and filtering fast. When he finished, he looked up at Thomas. "The water rights component is the most significant legally," he said. If Whitmore establishes a credible challenge to Valley water rights, he doesn't need the land fraud to work. He can simply charge for access until people can't pay and then collect. That's what I thought, Thomas said. But the forged document is the most actionable. He looked at Clara. This man Vasquez. He'll testify to what he saw. I believe so, Clara said. If he understands what it's for, I'd like to speak with him myself, today if possible. I can take you. Good. Alcott closed the journal. He looked at both of them. I need you to understand something. Whitmore has resources, and he has connections in Cheyenne that I do not have. This will not be fast, and it will not be clean. He will come after both of you before it's over. He will look for anything he can use. He's already sent a legal threat to Clara, Thomas said. He'll send more. Alcott looked at her directly. Miss Bennett, I've read what you wrote here. You understand legal strategy. You're documenting the way someone builds a case, not the way someone is making notes. Where did you learn that? Clara looked at him. I built a case once before, she said. Against a doctor in Chicago who was harming patients. I built it carefully and completely. And then I handed it to the people who were supposed to act on it, and they used it to determine how best to discredit me instead. Alcott was quiet. So you know what happens when evidence goes to the wrong people, he said. Yes. And you trust Walker here? Yes. And you trust me apparently based on the fact that Thomas trusts you, and Thomas does not trust people carelessly, she said. And based on the fact that you read my journal for 12 minutes, and your first question was about Whitmore's legal strategy, not about whether a woman had the right to be involved in this. Alcott looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled. All right, he said. Let's go see Vasquez. The ride to Hector Vasquez's property took 40 minutes, and by the time they arrived, Clara had given Alcott the full account of every family she had spoken to, in order with dates and details, and Alcott had asked 14 precise questions, and listened to every answer with the intensity of a man who was already constructing something in his mind. Hector Vasquez met them at the gate. He was 81, small, with hands that had done decades of hard work, and a face that had stopped worrying about impressions sometime around his 60th year. He looked at Alcott the way he looked at most things directly and without particular ceremony. You're the lawyer, he said. James Alcott. She said you were coming. He looked at Clara. You told him about the seal. Yes, Clara said. Will you tell him? Hector looked at Alcott for a long moment. The man who came to the Harmon family, he said. I was in the yard. I saw him. I saw the document he gave them. I read it. He touched his chest. Up here I read it. Not the words, the form of it. The county seal is a particular thing. I have it on my deed. I know what it looks like. The seal on that document was wrong. The inner ring was wrong. A man who makes copies doesn't always get the small things right. Could you describe the differences? Alcott said. Hector described them. Alcott wrote everything down. When Hector finished, he said, Will it help those people? The Harmons. All of them. The ones who signed his papers. The Calloways. If what you've described is accurate, Alcott said carefully, it may be the piece that opens the whole case. Hector nodded once. Then he looked at Clara. You're sure about this lawyer, he said. As sure as I am about anything, Clara said. Hector considered this. She is very sure about most things, he told Alcott. I have watched her work. So I understand, Alcott said. They rode back to Walker Ranch as the afternoon light went long and orange, and Clara listened to Alcott and Thomas talk through strategy in the front of the wagon, and felt with the clarity that came when complicated things resolved into simple ones that something had shifted. The evidence was real. The witness was credible. The lawyer was honest. And Whitmore, who had sent a letter expecting her to fold, had instead handed her the moment she needed to understand that he was afraid. Powerful men sent letters like that when they were afraid. She had not understood that in Chicago. She understood it now. She also understood with a quieter and more personal certainty that when Thomas Walker had said, "You're not alone now," across his kitchen table, he had not meant it as a tactical assessment, I had meant it the way people mean things when they have stopped calculating and started simply telling the truth. She pressed the thought down carefully, the way she pressed down on wounds that needed time before they could be properly addressed. There was still too much to do, but she held it quietly, the way you hold something fragile in both hands when you are walking somewhere difficult and you need to arrive with it intact. Alcott stayed in Silver Creek Valley for 3 days. He slept in the spare room at Margaret's house, which Margaret offered without being asked, and which Alcott accepted without ceremony. And in the mornings, he sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and asked her questions with the same focused attention. He gave everything, because Margaret Holt had been in this town for 30 years and knew things that weren't written anywhere. Margaret told him things that Clara had not known. The first was that Doyle Whitmore's representative had made a visit to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne 8 months ago and had come back with copies of the original survey records for the entire Silver Creek Valley Basin. Not the current records. The originals from the initial territorial survey of 1861, which used different boundary markers than the modern ones, and contained several ambiguities about watercourse ownership that had never been formally resolved because nobody had ever had reason to dispute them. "How do you know this?" Alcott asked. "Because the clerk at the land office is my nephew's wife's cousin," Margaret said with the serenity of a woman who understood that being underestimated was the most powerful social position available to a woman of her age in the American West. She mentioned it in a letter. "I didn't know what it meant at the time." "It means Whitmore has been planning the water rights challenge for at least 8 months, Alcott said. "Possibly longer. He came here knowing what he was going to do before he arrived." "He came here like a man who'd already drawn the map," Margaret said. "He just hadn't told the territory yet." Alcott wrote for 20 minutes without speaking. Clara sat across from him and watched and thought about the patience of it. The 18 months of careful quiet positioning the loans and the representatives and the survey records and the Cheyenne Bank, and felt a cold anger that was paradoxically clarifying. The anger was useful. It burned off the noise and left only the essential question: what needed to happen and in what order. "The water rights challenge is what we have to stop first," she said. Alcott looked up. "If he establishes that claim in territorial court, everything else becomes secondary," she continued. "The families who lose their land to the loan defaults can potentially be helped. The Harmons can pursue the fraud case. But if Whitmore controls the water, he controls the valley. Full stop." Alcott put down his pen. "You've thought this through," he said. "I've had nothing but time to think since that letter arrived," Clara said. "The water challenge requires a counterfiling in territorial court," Alcott said. "I can prepare it, but I need the current survey records for every property in the valley that has water access, and I need them to be pristine, no gaps, no disputes, no ambiguities of ownership." "Thomas has his," Clara said. "What about the others?" "Some of them may have signed documents with Whitmore's people that muddy the waters, so to speak." Alcott almost smiled at the unintentional precision of the phrase. "Which is where we need to move before Whitmore files his challenge," he said. "The moment he files, the clock changes. Everything we do after that point is defense. Before he files, we can still shape the ground." Clara looked at him. "How long do we have? Based on what your neighbor described about the land office visit 8 months ago, plus the time it takes to build a legal case of this complexity, I would estimate Whitmore is 2 to 4 weeks from filing." The kitchen went quiet. 2 to 4 weeks. "Then we have 1 week, Clara said. "Why 1 week?" "Because in 2 we may be wrong, and I don't operate on the outside edge of a margin." She told Thomas that evening. He stood in his kitchen and listened to everything: Alcott's assessment, the timeline, the land office information. Margaret had surfaced the 2 to 4 week window, and when she finished, he asked one question. "What do you need from me?" Not "are you sure?" Not "is Alcott certain?" Not "maybe we should wait." Just "what do you need?" Clara had prepared for resistance. The way she always prepared for resistance, and its absence did something unexpected to her composure. She recovered it quickly. "I need you to talk to every family in this valley who's had contact with Whitmore's people," she said. "Not about what they know, about what they still have physically. Every document, every letter, every record of payment or conversation. I need them collected and in Alcott's hands within 5 days. Some of them will be afraid, Thomas said. I know. Some of them may have been promised things by Whitmore's people. Protection, debt forgiveness, in exchange for staying quiet. I know that too. What do I tell them? Clara thought about it. Tell them the truth, she said. Tell them that a man in Cheyenne has spent 18 months building a mechanism to take this valley from them piece by piece legally and without apology. Tell them that we have a lawyer, and we have evidence, and we have a window. And tell them that the window doesn't stay open. She paused. And if they're afraid, which they should be because this is genuinely frightening, tell them that being afraid is not the same as being helpless. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Who told you that? He said. A patient, she said. In Chicago. A woman who was very sick and very frightened, and who showed up every week anyway. She held his gaze. I learned more from her than I learned from most of my teachers. He nodded. He picked up his hat from the table. I'll start tonight, he said. Tonight it's almost dark. Harmon Farm is 20 minutes. Collins's place is close. I can get 4 families tonight if I ride. Clara stared at him. You don't do anything halfway, she said. He stopped at the door. He looked at her with the specific expression she had catalogued over these weeks, the one she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. Neither do you, he said. That's why this is going to work. He left. Clara stood in his kitchen alone and permitted herself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not professional clarity and was not strategic thinking and was simply the feeling of standing in a place that felt against all the odds she had accumulated like somewhere she was supposed to be. Then she went to find Alcott and told him they had 5 days. What happened over those 5 days was something Clara would spend years trying to describe and never quite getting right, because the right language for it was not the language of legal proceedings or medical documentation. It was the language of community, which is imprecise by nature and resistant to being written down. Thomas wrote out each evening and came back with documents. Not all of them came willingly. The Prentice family, who had signed 2 of Whitmore's agreements and were behind on both, sent Thomas away the first night with the specific terror of people who have gambled on the wrong side of a fence and know it. He went back the second night anyway. He sat at their table. He told them what Alcott had explained, that the penalty clauses in their agreements may themselves be legally unenforceable under territorial contract law, that Alcott was already preparing a challenge, that the question was not whether the Prentice family was going to lose everything, but whether they would stand with the people who were trying to stop that from happening. Clara heard about that conversation from Thomas, who reported it factually, without self-congratulation. She heard about it again from Adeline Prentice, who appeared at Margaret's door on the 3rd morning and put a bundled stack of papers on the kitchen table and said simply, "He said you'd know what to do with these." Clara did. Alcott spent 40 minutes with the Prentice documents and found in the penalty clause section exactly what he had hoped to find, a provision that violated a territorial statute passed in 1884, which meant the accelerated repayment terms Whitmore had been invoking were not legally enforceable, regardless of what the document itself said. He drafted these contracts to look airtight, Alcott said, and they are mostly, but this clause. He tapped the paper. Whoever drafted this either didn't know the '84 statute or counted on nobody in this valley knowing it. He counted on exactly that, Clara said. He was almost right, Alcott said. He forgot to account for someone from Chicago who learned what bad contracts look like the hard way. Clara looked at him. Is it enough? It's enough to get the Prentice family's penalties invalidated. And if those penalties are invalid, the same clause appears in 3 other agreements I've seen, which means the defaults Whitmore's been calling are also invalid, Clara finished. Which means the land he's been claiming forfeit, Alcott said, may not be legally his to claim. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. She felt the specific sensation of a mechanism clicking into place. The same sensation she had felt in surgery when a procedure that had been going wrong suddenly went right, when the thing that had been resisting resolved under her hands and the path forward opened. What do we do with this? She said. We take it to the territorial circuit judge, Alcott said. Not Cheyenne. The circuit judge comes through Laramie next Thursday. I know him. I've argued before him. He's fair, and he's not in anyone's pocket, which cannot be said of everyone in the territorial judicial system. Thursday, Clara said. 5 days. Plenty of time, Alcott said, if we have everything we need. What else do we need? Vasquez's testimony in writing, signed. He paused. And I need something I don't have yet. I need evidence linking Whitmore personally to the forged document used with the Harmons. What we have is the forgery itself. What we need is the chain. Clara thought. The man who delivered it, she said. He wasn't Doyle. He wasn't Reeves. He was someone the Harmons hadn't seen before. And haven't seen since. But Hector saw him, Clara said slowly. And Hector described him. Older. A scar on his left jaw. A gray horse with one white stocking. Alcott looked at her. That's a very specific description. Hector notices details, Clara said. He always has. A gray horse with one white stocking, Alcott said, is not evidence of a connection to Whitmore, but it's a description of a man, and a man can be found. Leave that to me, Thomas said from the doorway. They both looked at him. He had come back from the morning's rounds, and neither of them had heard him arrive. There's a man named Kellerman at the freight office in Laramie, Thomas said. He tracks horses and men moving through the territory. It's not his official job, but he does it the way some people collect stamps, because it gives him a particular satisfaction. He came to the table. Give me Hector's description in writing. Kellerman will either know the man or know someone who does. Clara wrote it down. She handed it to Thomas. Their hands were close for a moment, not touching, but the kind of proximity that registers even when it doesn't close. Thomas folded the paper and put it in his coat. I'll ride to Laramie tonight, he said. Thomas, Clara said. That's 8 hours. 7 if the weather holds. You'll be exhausted. I've ridden in worse shape for worse reasons, he said. He looked at her when he said it. Not pointedly. Just directly the way he looked at everything, because he had apparently decided somewhere along the line that being direct was the only approach worth the trouble of being alive. He rode out that evening. He came back Thursday morning 4 hours before Alcott needed to leave for Laramie. He came back with a name. The name was Edgar Marsh, not Eliza Marsh's husband, no relation, just the particular cruelty of a shared name in a small place. Edgar Marsh was a man Kellerman had tracked through 3 territorial counties over the past 2 years, a man who appeared in the vicinity of certain legal disputes with certain documents, and then disappeared again, who had a gray horse with one white stocking and a scar on his left jaw, and who was... Kellerman had told Thomas with the quiet satisfaction of a man confirming a long-held theory on the payroll of a Cheyenne business concern owned in part by Charles Whitmore. Alcott held the paper. Thomas brought back and said nothing for 30 seconds. This is the chain, he said finally. Is it enough? Thomas said. Combined with Vasquez's testimony and the forged document itself, yes. He looked at both of them. Yes, it's enough. Clara felt the air in the room change. Then we go to Laramie, she said. You and Thomas should come, Alcott said. You're both witnesses, and I may need you to speak. The judge will want to hear from the people on the ground, not just the legal argument. What about the families? Thomas said. Bring the ones who can travel, Alcott said. The more people who appear before that judge, the harder it becomes to dismiss this as a private dispute between a businessman and a difficult nurse. He said the last words with a precision that told Clara he had already heard or correctly guessed how Whitmore's people would frame her involvement. He'll try to make this about me, she said. He already is, Alcott said. Morrison, his attorney, has filed an inquiry with the Territorial Medical Board about your licensure. I found out this morning. The room went still. When? Clara said. 3 days ago, before we had any of this. He set down his papers. He's been running 2 plays simultaneously. The legal scheme against the land and a preemptive strike against you personally in case you became a problem. Which I did, Clara said. Which you did. Alcott confirmed. She felt it, the familiar shape of it. The way powerful men reached for credibility as a weapon. The way the question "who is she to say anything" was deployed before the argument itself could be heard. "Will the medical board inquiry interfere with the court hearing?" Thomas asked. "Not directly. The board has no authority over a territorial land case. But if Morrison raises it in front of the judge as a character question, he'll try to discredit Clara before she speaks," Thomas said. His voice had gone flat in the particular way it went flat when he was controlling something with considerable force. "Yes," Alcott said. Thomas looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "Let him try," she said. They left for Laramie on Wednesday evening. Thomas and Clara and Alcott in Thomas's good wagon with Hector Vasquez riding alongside on his own horse, because he had said simply when told about the journey that he was not going to let a woman and a lawyer carry this alone, and nobody had argued with him. The Prentice family came. Adeline drove their wagon herself, because her husband's back was bad, and she had decided this was not a reason to stay home. Ruth Calloway came. She sat very straight in the back of the Prentice wagon, with her hands in her lap, and the expression of a woman who had spent weeks being afraid, and had finally calculated that being afraid was costing her more than moving forward. June Harmon came. She brought Alice, which Clara thought was either inadvisable or exactly right, and by the time they were an hour down the road, she had decided it was exactly right, because Alice Harmon at 8 years old, sitting in the wagon bed with her legs swinging, was the most concrete possible illustration of what was actually at stake. They rode through the night. Clara sat on the wagon bench beside Thomas, and they talked. Not about the case, not about the judge, not about what was going to happen tomorrow. They talked about other things, about where Thomas had grown up, which was Missouri, which surprised her. She had assumed he was native to Wyoming, the way the land itself was. About what had brought him west, which was a restlessness he described without drama, as simply the feeling that he hadn't arrived at his life yet, and that his life was probably in a direction where there was more space. She told him about nursing school, about the first surgery she had assisted, which had gone wrong in 3 different ways, and which she had managed with hands that shook but did not stop. About the patient who had told her in the 3rd year of her practice that she had the calmest hands of anyone who had ever touched him, and how she had not told him that the calm was something she had built on top of considerable terror, brick by careful brick. "You built yourself," Thomas said. "I had help," Clara said. "Good teachers." "That's not the same," he said. "Good teachers give you material. Building is what you do with it." She was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this," she said. "I've had years of quiet evenings," he said. "You think about things. What else have you thought about?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "That the hardest thing about losing someone," he said, "isn't the grief. The grief is terrible, but it has a shape. It does what grief does. The hardest thing is the silence that comes after. When you've been responsible for something for someone, and then you're not, and the space where that responsibility lived is just empty. And you build a life around the empty space instead of inside it, because inside it is where the pain is." Clara listened. "And then something changes," he said, not looking at her. Someone makes you realize that you've been building around a space that doesn't have to stay empty, that the space is just space." He paused. "That it's possible to put something else there." The wagon moved through the dark. Somewhere behind them, Hector Vasquez was humming something under his breath, old and shapeless, the kind of song that wasn't about anything except the comfort of making sound in the dark. "Thomas," Clara said. "Yes." "I don't know how to do this carefully," she said. "I've tried to be careful, and mostly what being careful has meant is keeping my distance from things I actually wanted. So I'm going to say it directly, because you said you appreciate directness." "I do," he said. "I'm not leaving Silver Creek Valley," she said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the medical board decides, whatever Whitmore does next, I'm not leaving. I'm going to build a proper clinic. I'm going to argue with Collins until he respects me, and fight with the territorial board until they recognize my qualifications and become the kind of institution that this valley needs." She looked at him. "And I would like very much not to do that alone, if that's something you'd want." Thomas Walker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I sent money to a builder in Cheyenne 6 days ago. Clara stared at him. "I had plans drawn for a clinic," he said. "Nothing large. Enough. On the eastern edge of my property with good light and a proper water supply. I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like something other than what it is." "What is it?" Clara said. "It's me believing you'll stay," he said, "and wanting to make staying possible." Clara looked at her hands. She thought about the letter that had brought her here, the promise that hadn't existed, the clinic that had never been built, the doctor who had died before she arrived. She thought about standing on that platform with $4 in her pocket and watching the last train leave and choosing to stay anyway. She thought about how that choosing had led here to this wagon, to this conversation, to this man who had sent money to a builder 6 days ago, because he believed in her before she'd said she believed in herself. "That's a very specific kind of faith," she said. "You've earned it," he said simply. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the reins. He turned his hand over. They rode the rest of the way to Laramie like that, in a silence that was the fullest thing Clara had felt in years. The Territorial Circuit Court convened at 9 in the morning. The judge was a man named Beaumont, 60 lean, with the economy of expression that comes from 20 years of separating what matters from what doesn't. Morrison was already there. He was 40, well-dressed with the kind of professional smoothness that came from winning frequently enough to expect it. He had a junior associate who kept organizing papers in ways that seemed intended to communicate importance. He looked at Clara when she came in. It was a specific look, the assessment of a man who has been told about someone and is now recalibrating the account against the reality and finding the reality more inconvenient than the account. Clara had received this look before. She returned it with the expression she had developed over 11 years, the one that was perfectly civil and communicated absolutely nothing about what she was thinking, which was a professional skill, and also, in this moment, a genuine pleasure. Alcott put his papers on the table with quiet efficiency. "Your Honor," he said when Beaumont called the matter. "We're here on 3 related matters. The first is a challenge to territorial water rights filed informally by a business entity connected to Mr. Charles Whitmore of Cheyenne. The second concerns the enforceability of loan agreements marketed to Silver Creek Valley Ranch families under terms that violate the Territorial Contract Act of 1884. And the third is a matter of criminal fraud connected to forged documentation used to extract payment from at least one Valley family and potentially others." Morrison was on his feet. "Your Honor, only the first matter was properly noticed." "Mr. Morrison," Beaumont said, "sit down. Mr. Alcott will present his matters, and then you'll have your opportunity." Morrison sat down. His expression did not change, but something behind it did, and Clara saw it. Alcott presented the water rights case first. The survey records, the ambiguities, the 1861 documents Whitmore had obtained, and the counter-evidence from the current land records that established continuous uncontested water access by the Valley families for over 20 years. He presented it calmly, thoroughly, and without embellishment, which was the right approach for Beaumont, who Clara had correctly assessed within 10 minutes of the proceedings, as a man who trusted the clean fact. Then Alcott presented the contract case. He put the Prentice Agreement on the table open to the penalty clause and read the relevant section of the 1884 statute. He explained the discrepancy in plain language. He had 3 other agreements with the same clause. Beaumont looked at the documents for a long time. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "are you aware of the 1884 statute provision as it relates to this clause?" Morrison said that the agreements had been reviewed by qualified attorneys. Beaumont said that was not the question he had asked. Morrison said he would need to review the specific provision. "Take a moment," Beaumont said. It was not a generous offer. It was the kind of thing said when the answer was already known and the delay was merely procedural. Then Alcott presented the fraud case. He put Hector Vasquez on the stand, which was technically a chair placed to the left of the judge's table, and Hector Vasquez sat in it, the way he sat everywhere, as though the location were irrelevant, and what mattered was what he had to say. He said it. Every detail, the document, the seal, the difference, the man with the gray horse and the scar. His confidence about what he had seen stated without drama or performance, which was more persuasive than drama or performance would have been. Then Alcott put the paper in front of the judge. The connection between Edgar Marsh and Whitmore's business concern, assembled by Kellerman in Laramie, signed and attested. Morrison objected 3 times. Beaumont overruled 3 times. Then Morrison said, with the controlled desperation of a man watching a plan disassemble in real time, "Your Honor, I'd like to raise a matter regarding one of the individuals involved in this presentation. A Miss Clara Bennett, who has been at the center of the organization of this case, is currently under inquiry by the Territorial Medical Board for practicing medicine without proper licensure. I submit that this inquiry bears on the credibility of Mr. Morrison." Beaumont's voice had not changed in volume. It didn't need to. "I'm not interested in Miss Bennett's medical credentials. I'm interested in the documents she helped compile and the witnesses she helped locate. The documents are real. The witnesses are credible. Miss Bennett's professional licensure is a matter for the medical board and has no bearing on the truth or falsity of a forged seal on a contract document." He paused. "Is that clear?" A silence. "Yes, Your Honor," Morrison said. Clara, sitting in the second row, felt something release in her chest, a pressure she had been holding without fully knowing it. The weight of Chicago, of the administrator's office, of the way her truth had been made irrelevant by the question of who she was. Here the question of who she was had been dismissed as beside the point. The truth was the point. She had believed that once before Chicago. She had spent 2 years rebuilding the belief. And Beaumont in one quiet sentence had confirmed it. She looked at Thomas beside her. He was looking at her. He had seen her face. He said nothing, which was the right thing. He simply nodded once very slightly, in the way that meant, "I see it, and I know, and you did this." Beaumont ruled on all 3 matters before noon. The water rights challenge was denied on the basis of established continuous use, with a note that any future challenge would require evidence of a quality substantially beyond what had been informally submitted. The penalty clauses in Whitmore's loan agreements were found unenforceable under the 1884 statute, which rendered the associated defaults invalid. The forged document matter was referred for criminal investigation to the Territorial Marshal's Office with Alcott's documentation of the Marsh-Whitmore connection attached. The Callaway Eastern 40 acres had not yet been formally transferred. Beaumont's ruling on the default invalidity stopped that transfer before it completed. Ruth Callaway, sitting behind Clara, made a sound that was very small and very specific. The sound of someone who has been holding their breath for a long time and has finally been given permission to breathe. Clara heard it and felt it in her sternum. Outside the courthouse in the afternoon light, the Valley families stood together. The Prentices, Ruth Callaway, June Harmon, with Alice on her hip, Hector Vasquez, who was trying not to look as if he had known how it would end, which he had. Thomas stood beside Clara. He didn't put his arm around her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which was its own complete statement. Alcott shook hands with Thomas, and then with Clara, and said, "Whitmore will appeal. He has resources, and he's not done. But he's lost the ground he needed, and a criminal investigation changes his position considerably." "Will he come after Clara?" Thomas asked. "He'll try the medical board route," Alcott said. "But I've drafted a formal credential recognition request to the Territorial Board on Clara's behalf. With 12 years of documented practice, and now a public case in which her work contributed to exposing territorial fraud." He paused. "I think they'll find the recognition is in their interest." Clara looked at him. "You drafted that already," she said. "3 days ago," he said, "when I read your journal." He picked up his satchel. "You document like someone who expected to have to prove themselves eventually. All I did was formalize what you'd already built." He walked toward his horse. Clara stood in the afternoon light and thought about the journal, the careful handwriting, the dates and details, the professional habit she had maintained through 11 years and 2 states, and the worst of what had happened. She had built her case again. This time, it had been believed. She turned to Thomas. He was watching her with the particular expression that she had, by now, stopped pretending to misunderstand. "Your clinic is going to have good light," he said. The builder confirmed the eastern wall placement. "You've already been in contact with the builder since..." "This morning," he said. "Before we came in." Clara looked at him. "You were certain," she said. "I was determined," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Certainty doesn't account for obstacles," he said. "Determination does." She thought about Wyoming, about the platform, about the $4 and the nothing where her future was supposed to be. She thought about choosing to stay. "Yes," she said, "it does." He offered her his arm. She took it. Ruth Calloway, 10 feet away, saw this and said something quietly to Adeline Prentice, and Adeline Prentice pressed her lips together in the expression of a woman successfully suppressing considerable satisfaction. Hector Vasquez looked at the sky and hummed. Alice Harmon said loudly to her mother, "Is the nurse going to live at the ranch now?" June Harmon said, "That's not our business, Alice." "But is she?" Thomas, who had heard this, kept his eyes forward, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed, the particular change of a man working very hard not to smile. "Come on," Clara said. "We have a long ride back." She did not answer Alice's question, but she held Thomas Walker's arm all the way to the wagon, and she did not let go when they climbed up onto the bench, and the answer was in that for anyone who was paying attention. Most of them were paying attention. The ride back from Laramie took 7 hours. Nobody talked much for the first 2. Not because there was nothing to say. There was everything to say, but because the people in those wagons had been running on fear and urgency and the specific fuel of having something to fight for. And now the fight had shifted into something that wasn't over but had changed shape, and the body needed time to understand that before the mouth could find the right words. Ruth Calloway slept for an hour in the back of the Prentice wagon, her head against Adeline's shoulder, which Clara saw when she turned to check on the group, and which stayed with her. The image of a woman who had held herself rigid for weeks, finally allowing herself to rest against something solid. Alice Harmon predictably had no need of quiet adjustment time, and spent the first hour explaining to Hector Vasquez, who rode alongside, that her mother said she had almost died of a fever, and that the nurse had saved her, to which Hector replied that yes, he knew. And Alice said, "How did he know?" And Hector said, "Because he had been paying attention." And Alice considered this, and said she was also paying attention. And Hector said yes, he could tell, and something in the way he said it made Alice sit up straighter for the rest of the ride. Thomas drove. Clara sat beside him on the bench. They had not released the arrangement that had begun when she took his arm outside the courthouse. Not the arm itself, which the practicality of climbing onto a wagon bench had interrupted, but the thing underneath the arm, the understanding that had been stated and received and was now simply part of the air between them. "You're quiet," Thomas said after the second hour. "I'm thinking," Clara said. "About what?" "About what comes next," she said. "Alcott said Whitmore will appeal." "He will. And the medical board inquiry is still open. Alcott's filing will address it. It may not resolve it immediately. These things take time." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "is this you finding reasons to worry, or is there something specific you're worried about?" She looked at him. It was a precise question. She had noticed that about him, that when he asked something, he had already thought about the possible answers and was asking the specific thing he needed to know, not a general version of it. "Both," she admitted. "Tell me the specific thing." She looked at the road ahead. "Whitmore's attorney raised my licensure in front of the judge," she said. "Beaumont dismissed it. But Whitmore's people are going to use it. Anywhere they can. In the medical board inquiry, in whatever appeal Morrison files, in the conversations people have about what happened in that courtroom. They're going to say that the case was built by a woman who had no legal standing to practice medicine in this territory, which will make some people question everything connected to her." "Some people," Thomas said. "Yes." "Which people?" She thought about it. "The ones who were uncertain about me to begin with," she said. "Gerald Briggs. The men who thought a woman had no place making medical decisions. If Whitmore's people work that angle, they'll find an audience." "And that troubles you," Thomas said. "It troubles me because those are the same people who will decide whether the clinic is accepted," Clara said. "Whether I'm accepted. Not legally, socially. A clinic without the community's trust is a building." Thomas drove in silence for a moment. "You know what I've noticed," he said, in the years I've been in this valley. What? That people follow the loudest voice until something louder comes along, he said. Gerald Briggs is loud. He's been the loudest voice on the subject of you since you arrived. He paused. But Roy Sutter can walk downstairs without pain now. Frank Hollis can use his right arm properly for the first time in 3 years. Alice Harmon is in the back of that wagon telling an 81-year-old man about paying attention. He glanced at her. Those are louder than Gerald Briggs. They just take more time to reach full volume. Clara looked at her hands. You're an optimist, she said. I'm a rancher, he said. We're practical by definition. I'm telling you what I've observed. She almost smiled. And if Whitmore's appeal delays everything? The criminal investigation, the contract rulings. Then we wait, Thomas said. And while we wait, the clinic gets built. And while the clinic gets built, you keep doing what you've been doing. And every person you help is another person who knows what the truth is, regardless of what Morrison files in Cheyenne. Clara was quiet. She thought about the platform, about the nothing where her future was supposed to be. She thought about how the thing she had built in Silver Creek Valley had not been built on promises or on anyone's permission. It had been built on showing up, on doing the work, on the accumulation of trust. One person at a time, one treatment at a time, one conversation at a time. Whitmore could file whatever he wanted. He could not unfill Roy Sutter's knee, or unclear Daniel Cho's chest, or unsave Alice Harmon. All right, she said. All right. You've made your case, she said. I'll stop looking for reasons to worry. I didn't say stop looking, Thomas said. I said tell me the specific thing. There's a difference. She looked at him. You do that, she said. Do what? Make the precise distinction, she said, between the actual thing and the general version of it. It matters, he said simply. Yes, she said. It does. They rode on, and the Wyoming landscape moved around them, and for the first time since she had stepped off the train in Silver Creek, Clara let herself simply be in the place she was, without measuring the distance to the exit. They arrived back in Silver Creek Valley as the evening settled in. The wagon came down the main street and Margaret Holt was on her porch, which Clara was almost certain she had been on since they left, and when she saw them coming, she stood and put her hands on her hips, and her expression did the complicated thing it did when she was feeling several strong emotions simultaneously, and had decided to present only the most manageable one. Well, she said when Thomas pulled the wagon up. We won, Clara said. Margaret was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, Come inside, I made food. Which was Clara had learned how Margaret Holt said everything that mattered, not in the words, but in the having prepared in the anticipation of return, in the table already set for people she had believed were coming back. The Prentices came in. Ruth Calloway came in. June Harmon carried Alice, who had fallen asleep in the last mile, and remained asleep despite being moved, which was the particular talent of children who had decided rest was non-negotiable. Hector Vasquez came in and sat at the table and said nothing, and ate everything placed in front of him, with the appreciation of a man who had decided the evening was exactly what it should be. Thomas came in last. He sat across from Clara. Margaret moved between table and kitchen, and deposited plates, and asked no questions, which was the loudest form of curiosity available to a woman who had decided the situation required restraint. Somewhere between the second helping of food and the coffee, the room became something. Not a celebration exactly too tired for that, too aware of what remained unfinished. But the particular warmth of people who have been through something difficult together and have emerged on the same side, which is its own category of human experience, and one of the better ones. Frank Hollis appeared at the door. At some point someone had told him, and stood in the entry, looking at the assembled group with the expression of a man recalibrating. It worked, he said. It worked, Thomas said. Frank looked at Clara. He said nothing for a moment. Good, he said. And then, with visible effort, told you she knew what she was doing. Clara was fairly certain he had not told anyone that, but she accepted it with a straight face. Thank you, Frank, she said. He nodded and left, because Frank Hollis had made his peace, and that was enough for one evening. 3 days after Laramie, Gerald Briggs came to see Clara. She was in the back room at Margaret's, still the back room, still the window that required a shoulder to open. Though that situation was, she had decided temporary when Margaret appeared in the doorway with an expression that combined warning and entertainment in equal measure. "Gerald Briggs is here," Margaret said. Clara set down her pen. "Send him in," she said. Gerald Briggs was 60 thick through the middle, with a face that had spent decades arranging itself into expressions of authority. He came into the back room and looked around it at the shelves, the instruments, the organized professional reality of the space, and something moved in his face that was not his usual skepticism. He held his hat in his hands. That told Clara everything before he said a word. "Miss Bennet," he said. "Mr. Briggs. I heard what happened in Laramie." "Yes." A pause. "My wife," he said. "She's been coming to see you." "She has," Clara said, neither confirming nor denying more than that. Margaret Briggs's consultations were Margaret Briggs's business. "She's different," he said, "since she started coming." He stopped, started again. "Happier. And she told me things I didn't know, about how she'd been feeling, things she'd been managing alone." His jaw tightened. "I didn't know." Clara waited. "I didn't know," he said again, "because she didn't tell me, because she thought I wouldn't." He stopped. "Because she thought you would minimize it," Clara said gently. He looked at the floor. "Probably," he said. "The good news," Clara said, "is that she's doing better. The better news is that she told you, which means she trusts you with it now, which is worth something." He was quiet for a long time. "I've been saying things," he said, "about you, around town." "I know. I was wrong," he said. "It cost him." She could see it cost him, and she did not make it cheaper or more expensive than it was. "I know that too," she said. "I'm not going to—" He cleared his throat. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know." He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time with the complex expression of a man who has discovered that the thing he was afraid of was not actually what he thought it was, and has not yet decided what to do with that discovery. "If you need anyone to say something," he said to the board, "to whoever's asking questions, about whether you should be allowed to practice here." He stopped. "You can tell them I said you should." He left before she could respond. Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote in her journal, "Gerald Briggs. This morning. In the category of things I did not expect." And she put a small mark beside it, the mark she used when something mattered enough to return to. 2 weeks after Laramie, the Territorial Medical Board sent a letter. Not a warning. Not an inquiry. A provisional recognition of Clara's credentials, pending formal review, effective immediately, allowing her to practice medicine in Wyoming Territory under her existing qualifications, while the full licensure process completed. Alcott had written to the board. Beaumont had apparently also written unsolicited, which Alcott told her later was extremely unusual for Beaumont, and indicated something about the judge's private opinion of how Morrison had handled the court appearance. Gerald Briggs had written. Ruth Calloway had written. June Harmon had written, which surprised Clara most. June quiet. June, who had stood in a doorway and not said anything for 5 minutes before telling Clara about the fear she'd been carrying. Dr. Collins had written. Clara learned this last from Collins himself, who appeared at Margaret's house on a Tuesday morning and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, a gesture she was noting that seemed to be the Silver Creek Valley way of announcing that one had come to say something uncomfortable, and told her that he had written to the board in support of her recognition. "Why?" Clara said. "Because you're competent," he said. "And because this valley needs more than one person who knows what they're doing medically. And I am not young, and my back is getting worse, and I cannot keep pretending either of those things is not true." "Your back," Clara said. "How long?" 3 years. "Have you let anyone look at it?" "I'm looking at someone who might be able to," he said with the dignity of a man making a considerable concession. Clara stood aside and let him in. She spent 40 minutes with him. When she was done, she gave him the same thing she had given Roy Sutter and Frank Hollis and every other man who had walked in carrying pain. He had decided was simply his to manage the truth about what was happening, what could be helped, and what the path forward looked like. Collins listened. He asked 2 questions. He nodded. "You're good," he said when she was finished. Not easily, but directly. "I know," she said equally directly. "So are you." He looked at her. Then, with the precision of a man choosing his words, the way he would choose an instrument, he said, "I'd like to talk about how we work together properly. Not you treating ranch workers while I pretend not to notice. Properly." "Yes," Clara said. "I'd like that too." It was the beginning of something that would become over the following months a genuine partnership, not without friction, because Collins was 63 and had strong opinions and was not constitutionally inclined to defer, and Clara was equally opinionated and had spent too long having her judgment questioned to accept doubt as a default. But productive friction, the kind that makes both things stronger. Margaret Holt told about this development, said only, "Took him long enough," and went back to her kitchen. The clinic broke ground on a Thursday in October. Thomas had been managing the builder's communications for weeks, checking in on progress, making decisions about materials that Clara had not yet been consulted about, and which she discovered when she finally saw the plans properly had been made, with a specific understanding of what she needed. The examination room was larger than she had asked for, which Thomas explained was because a room that was too small got smaller over time, and a room with room to expand stayed useful. The storage was organized in a way that mirrored how she organized her bag. The logic of someone who had watched her work and understood the order of it, which was not the order anyone else would have invented. The window wall faced east. Good light. Clara stood in the unfinished frame of it on the first day of construction and turned around slowly, taking in the dimensions, the angles, the particular quality of the eastern morning light coming through where the windows would be. Thomas stood in the doorway watching her. "Well," he said. "You've been paying very close attention," she said. "For several months now," he said. "To my work." "Among other things," he said. She turned to face him. In the weeks since Laramie, the thing that had been acknowledged on the wagon bench had not been rushed. There had been no dramatic declaration, no moment engineered for its effect. There had been instead the quiet accumulation of ordinary time spent together. Mornings at the clinic site, evenings at the ranch. Conversations that ranged from the practical to the personal, with the natural ease of people who had stopped being careful with each other and started simply being honest. She had told him about her parents. He had told her about Missouri and the restlessness and the years in Wyoming before he bought the land. She had told him about the surgeon who had been her best teacher and the way his hands had moved and what it had made her believe was possible. He had told her about his wife, not the grief which they had already talked about, but her as a person, her laugh, her opinions about cattle, the way she had made a home out of a ranch that had been purely functional before she arrived. He told that part without pain, with the particular piece of someone who has been through grief and come out on the other side of it, not unscathed but whole, carrying the loss as part of himself rather than instead of himself. Clara had listened to all of it. She had told him things she had not told anyone about the moment in the administrator's office when she had realized the decision had already been made about the 3 months in the apartment in Chicago, listening to the unfinished piano piece through the thin wall about the specific texture of deciding to answer Hayes's letter when every reasonable instinct said the situation was too uncertain. He had listened to all of it. "I have a question," Thomas said now in the unfinished clinic doorway. "Ask it," she said. "I built this for you," he said. "That's not the question, that's the context. The question is whether you'd be willing to let me be here for what comes next. Not the clinic." He paused. "Everything." Clara looked at him. She thought about the $4, the empty platform, the letter with the fold lines worn white. The choice repeated every day since she arrived to stay and build and believe. She had built a practice. She had built a case. She had built against every expectation she and everyone else had brought to the situation a home. "Thomas," she said, "you sent money to a builder before you asked me a single personal question. You wrote to Alcott the same night we discussed it. You described your wife to me in the dark on a road to Laramie because you had decided the honest thing was to let me know who you were. Yes, he said. You have been answering this question with your actions for months, she said. I'm a little behind on the words is all. He looked at her. Then take your time, he said. I'll wait. I don't need time, she said. I've had time. I spent 2 years being careful and cautious and keeping the right distance from things I wanted. I'm done with that approach. She crossed the unfinished floor to where he stood. Yes, all of it. Everything. Yes. He reached out and took her face in both hands. The way she had learned was characteristic of him. The gentleness of a man whose hands had spent decades doing hard things and had therefore learned to do soft things with particular care. He kissed her once in the doorway of the unfinished clinic in the October Wyoming light. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind that happened in the novels that Margaret Holt kept on her shelf and claimed were for long evenings. It was the kind of kiss that meant I have found the thing I was looking for, and I am not going anywhere, and neither are you. Which was, Clara thought, precisely the right kind. Whitmore's appeal was filed in November. It was denied in February. The criminal investigation into Edgar Marsh proceeded through the winter and resolved in spring, with Marsh cooperating fully in exchange for reduced charges and implicating in the process 2 other men in Whitmore's organization who had been involved in similar schemes in 2 other territorial counties. Whitmore himself was not charged criminally. His attorneys were too good, and his distance from the direct actions too carefully constructed. But the civil findings stood. The water rights challenge was permanently dismissed, and the business entity through which he had operated in Silver Creek Valley was dissolved by order of the territorial court. He did not attempt to return to Silver Creek Valley. Alcott sent Clara a letter in March saying simply, "It's done. Well done." She put it in the tin box where she kept the important documents next to Hayes's original letter, which she had kept for reasons she had not fully understood until she returned to it one evening and read it again. The promise of honest work and a community that needed help, and realized that Hayes had been right about all of it, just wrong about the mechanism. The clinic he'd promised had never been built. But the need had been real, and she had come, and the rest was what you made of the gap between the promise and the reality. The clinic was licensed formally in April. Dr. Collins attended the small ceremony which was held in the clinic itself and attended by most of Silver Creek Valley in the informal fashion of a community that had decided something mattered and turned out accordingly. Margaret Holt brought food. Ruth Calloway brought flowers, which she said she had grown herself and had been planning to bring for the occasion since January. Roy Sutter walked in under his own power, with a stride that was not quite what it had been at 40, but was considerably better than what it had been a year ago, and stood in the corner with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was allowing himself to feel something he didn't have a name for. Frank Hollis came. He shook Clara's hand at the door and said, "You did good," which Clara received as the highest possible compliment available from Frank Hollis. Alice Harmon ran through the clinic with the energy of an 8-year-old who had decided the occasion was exciting, and the best way to engage with it was at full speed until June caught her and redirected her toward the food table, which worked briefly. Hector Vasquez sat in the chair nearest the window, the good eastern light, and said nothing all afternoon, and looked satisfied in the way that old men look satisfied when the world has briefly aligned with their understanding of how it should work. Thomas stood at the back of the room, not in the center, not performing. At the back, the way he stood at the back of most things, present steady, making space for what needed to be in front. Clara found him there after the ceremony, after the handshakes, and the community warmth, and the particular joy of a milestone reached in company. She stood beside him. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Like I'm exactly where I was supposed to end up," she said. "Which is strange because I arrived here by accident." "Nobody arrives anywhere entirely by accident," he said. "Hayes's letter was a coincidence. His death was a coincidence. My being on that platform with $4 was the result of a decade of decisions you made," Thomas said. "About what was right and what wasn't. About whether to tell the truth when it cost you. About which direction to go when there was nothing certain in any direction. He looked at her. That's not accident. That's character. And character is what ends up where it's supposed to be. Clara looked at the room full of people she had come to know. Each of them a story. Each of them a version of the thing she had chosen again and again, to believe that the person in front of you mattered, and was worth your best effort, and deserved to be treated as someone whose pain was real, and whose life could be better. She had believed that in Chicago. She believed it here. The difference was that here people believed it back. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," Thomas said. "What you told me on the wagon," she said. "About building a life around an empty space. About the possibility of putting something else there." "Yes." "Have you," she said, "put something there?" He looked at her. The April light came through the east-facing windows. The windows he had specified, the light he had thought about when he was planning a space for her before she had asked him to. "Clara," he said, "you are what I put there." And she felt it not as a weight, not as a responsibility, not as the terrifying thing that love had sometimes been, when it came with conditions and consequences, and the constant threat of being retracted. She felt it as what it was, a fact. A simple, durable, hard-won fact, the kind that had been tested by difficulty and had held. She took his hand. He held it. Around them Silver Creek Valley continued in the way that communities continue, noisily, warmly, imperfectly, full of the particular abundance of people who have been through something hard together and have come out knowing each other's names and what each person carries and how to be useful when carrying is required. Years later, people in Silver Creek Valley still told the story. They told it the way all the best Western stories get told, around tables and stages, with the details slightly different each time, because memory is not a document, and truth is not a transcript. And the living stories are the ones that change shape a little in the telling, like water finding its level. They told the part about the nurse who stepped off a train with $4 and no one waiting for her and refused to leave. They told the part about the cowboy who had spent years building a life around grief and met the one person who made him understand that grief was not the same as the end. They told the part about the courtroom in Laramie and Hector Vasquez describing a seal and the judge's voice saying, "That is not the question I asked." They told the part about the clinic with the east-facing windows. They told the part about the wedding small in October. The same month, the clinic broke ground in the church that leaned slightly to the left, with Margaret Holt crying in the front row and claiming she was not, and Alice Harmon as flower girl, who had taken the assignment with great seriousness and executed it at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be afterward. They told Thomas's toast, which was not a speech, but 2 sentences. "I spent years learning what courage looks like from the outside. Clara taught me what it looks like from the inside." They told Clara's, which was not a speech either. "I came here with nothing but what I knew how to do." It turned out that was exactly enough. They told the story to their children, and their children told it to their children, and it traveled the way true things travel, not perfectly, not completely, but with its essential truth intact. A woman who had been told she was not enough in a city that no longer wanted her had come west and discovered that enough was not a fixed quantity, that it expanded when you kept going, that the people who called you too much were always the ones who had decided to stop short of what was possible. A man who had decided love was something that belonged to the past had discovered in the most ordinary possible way, through weeks of Monday mornings and shared lunches and a wagon ride through the night, that the past was not a wall. It was a road, and roads lead somewhere. They led to this, a clinic with good light on the eastern edge of Walker Ranch, a doctor who had learned to share her practice and her town and her life, a cowboy who had stopped riding his fence lines alone and had started instead coming home to where someone was waiting. The love between them was not a story of rescue. It was a story of recognition. 2 people who looked at each other and saw clearly and without flinching exactly who the other person was, and chose them anyway, and kept choosing every day in the ordinary way that real love is sustained, through showing up, through honesty, through the patient and renewable decision to be present to the life you have built together. That was the legend of Silver Creek Valley. Not the court case, though they were proud of that. Not the defeated scheme, though they told it with satisfaction. Not even the clinic, though it stood for decades and treated 3 generations of Valley families and trained 7 nurses and outlasted every building on the main street. The legend was simpler than any of those things. It was a woman who kept going when everything stopped, and a man who remembered how to begin again, and the valley that held both of them, and the life they built in it together, solid and real and permanent as the Wyoming bedrock, as undeniable as the eastern light, through a well-placed window on a clear morning, as lasting as any true thing ever is. They had come to Silver Creek Valley by accident and by grief, and by a letter that contained a lie and a truth. Simultaneously, the lie that a clinic existed, and the truth that help was needed, and that the person coming was equal to it. And they had stayed, and they had built, and the building held. That is what courage looks like from the inside, not the absence of fear, but the decision made again and again and again to stay anyway, because the people who need you are real, and the love that finds you is real, and the life you choose to build with your own hands is the only life that was ever truly yours to live.